Drums keep pounding a rhythm to the brain. La-di-da-di-dee, la-di-da-di-da. Charleston was once the race. History has been the stage. And the beat goes on, and the beat goes on.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adrian Wootton, and I am the curator of the Cinema Made in Italy program, which normally showcases the most exciting new Italian films made in a particular year and has a lovely live showcase presenting the films in London at the Cine Lumiere in March with the filmmakers present to talk to me and the audiences about their work. Well, obviously, circumstances have prevented us staging the event in that way this year. However, Film Italia and the Cinecittà Luce did approach me and say, would I still select some films which, in a partnership with the platform Mubi, will be actually shown from the 16th to the 29th of April on that platform, giving the opportunity for UK audiences to see these movies, which they wouldn't otherwise be able to see. So I did that. We selected the 9 movies, and they are all being shown. And also with the support of Film Italia and actually the Italian Cultural Institute, I'm delighted to say that the filmmakers have agreed to be interviewed, to chat to me about their films on this Italian Cultural Institute Vimeo channel, and that will obviously coincide with the screenings of the film on Mubi. So I'm really grateful to Film Italia for setting this up, to Mubi for hosting the movies, for the Italian Cultural Institute to providing access to their Vimeo channel, and of course to the filmmakers. And I'm really, really pleased today to welcome 2 filmmakers for a wonderful documentary that I really, really enjoyed seeing, and it's a great pleasure to have them here. The film is Life as a B movie, Piero Vivarelli, and we have Nick Vivarelli and Fabrizio Laurenti, the 2 filmmakers who've made this film, here virtually with us. I really wish you gentlemen were with us in London and we were doing this live on stage, but needs must, and I'm still very glad that you've made yourself available to chat to me. So welcome to the virtual Cinema Made in Italy 2021.
Thank you, Adrian. Thanks so much. It's
so
great to be here.
Well, it's great to be chatting to you. So let's kick off and talk about Life as a B movie. I mean, this is an extraordinary story about this amazing kind of filmmaker, impresario, music promoter, music songwriter, Piero Vivarelli. And for people that don't know anything about him or his work, this is a fantastic introduction, but set the scene about what kind of figure he was in Italian culture and Italian movies in the 60s, 70s, 80s onwards.
So first off, on a personal note, Piero Vivarelli was my uncle, okay? And I always knew that I had this kind of wacky uncle. But it wasn't until there was a retrospective at the Venice Film Festival called Kings of the Italian Bees that I fully realized the character that I had access to through my family. And that retrospective in 2004 was really important. And it was godfathered by Quentin Tarantino.
I remember I was there, yeah.
And of course, my uncle's film, Il Dio Serpente, the snake god, was featured there. And that's when I realized, and I'm a film journalist. That's when I realized that I really had something on my hands that I should do something about. And what did I have on my hands? Okay, so I had someone who basically rode a wave of energy that was there after the war in Italy, and he rode this wave in different aspects. He rode the music wave by basically bringing rock and roll to Italy, although he didn't do it single-handedly, but he was very instrumental to that. He wrote some big pop songs that went around the world, the most famous of which is probably 24.000 baci, which has been covered by Johnny Hallyday in France, and which has been in plenty of movies, including Dolly Bell by Kusturica. So I had the musical aspect. Then I had this film aspect, someone who, as a director, made almost every single genre that you could imagine, okay? And always did it with a certain kind of stamp. He really had a personal stamp, even though he was working within commercial constraints. And then on top of that, I had someone who, during the war, had sort of run away from home and joined the Republic of Salò and had a sort of fascist kind of experience, and then who, after the war, became a very early supporter of the Cuban Revolution and became personally close to Fidel Castro. Maybe not personally, but anyway, had a close rapport with Fidel Castro. And then on top of that, I just had this incredible kind of example of a certain kind of vitality that only the post-war years, I think, could generate, and specifically the Italian scene. Okay, so those are some of the elements. I don't want to go too long.
But and those elements, I mean, that's a lot. That's a big story, and to encapsulate that is quite difficult. And obviously 2004, you made the movie. Fabrizio, where did you come in? Because you're an experienced documentary filmmaker who've made films on a whole variety of different subjects. Where did you come into this picture when Nick's got all this, and how did you come to work with him on it?
We were sharing a studio in Rome. We've been knowing each other for many years, and we were actually working on a project about Cecchi Gori. And at one point, I had interviewed Piero Vivarelli about Mussolini. I was doing a documentary on Mussolini, viewed from people who had met him personally, still alive. And Piero was one of these. So I went to interview Piero, and as often it happens with Piero, I was told that you start with an item, something, and then it goes everywhere. I mean, he spoke for 4 hours about everything, pop music, sex, and revolution, and whatever, religion, soccer, whatever. And it was always interesting. So when I got back with the interview, I managed to cut it down to a few minutes, the one about Mussolini that I needed.
This is Mussolini's Body, the film Mussolini's Body.
Mussolini's Body, he's in that too. And I asked, and I told Nick, Piero is bigger than life. I mean, he's this guy, we should pursue him. And unfortunately, it took us a long time to join forces together. He passed away in the meantime. Meanwhile, and then we decided, we should do it. Let's do it together.
And what were I mean, obviously, often films take very long gestation, but what were the obstacles, because I have to be honest, until 2004 I was in the same position as most people. I didn't know who he was, and I knew that connection which you talk about really, really well in the film about Django and his script writing contribution to that sort of Corbucci movie, which obviously is beloved of Tarantino amongst others. What was the sort of perception of him when you started working together on this documentary? What was the perception of him in Italy? Had the 2004 retrospective raised his profile enough that people were really aware of him? Was his work known at that point?
Besides the people, we found a lot of people knew him. He knew a lot of people from all sorts of musicians, filmmakers, politicians. We kind of wrote down a list of people who were interested. We were interested in interviewing, and we got to 40 people, 50, something like that. And unfortunately or luckily, some of them were old enough that while we were shooting, they passed away before we had the chance to interview them. And some, we just got them earlier, before, and all sorts of, from communists to right wings, from Pupialati, it was certain kind of cinema, to B movies, producer and directors. It was really everywhere. And it was actually what was surprising for me was that it was actually appreciated and loved by all these people who met him, and especially the women. He had a very convoluted personal and sexual life, but all the people, all the women that we interviewed, ex-wives, ex-girlfriends, whatever, they were always very fond of him, and they said, "Oh, Piero, he respected us, he loved us, and we felt always comfortable with him around, and he was open and all that." And that was kind of an interesting approach. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you, Nick's point of view, from a family point of view, because that's one of the things that really comes across very, very strongly in the documentary, is that you have the family members, you have both, wives and lovers talking, and they don't seem to have any kind of bitterness or enmity towards him. I mean, considering that he, as you said, was a sort of serial adulterer, and had lots and lots and lots of girlfriends, and sometimes simultaneously, the women sort of talk about him with great affection. I was really surprised by including his first wife.
Yeah, I think he was he really had a lot of charm. And I think that he was very, as it comes across, I think he was very narcissistic, obviously, totally self-centered, but he was also very generous in a way, and he had a certain kind of candor, and he was almost like a child in a way, I think. And I don't think he had a bad bone in his body, even though he probably did some, there's a dark side to him, which we do go into.
Yes, you do.
In the documentary. But I think, going back to what you were asking before about, how well was he known in Italy? The truth is that he had, his star was very high, like in the 60s. But after that, it kind of declined. And so, yes, there were people who knew him, and, there were, but by and large, he'd been kind of cast aside. And I think that's another aspect that's interesting and that I cared about, which was just to kind of, not just to talk about him, but to talk about the world that he represents, which is this kind of alternate world of Italian cinema. What was described in the retrospective in Venice as the secret history of Italian cinema. And as Corbucci puts it, through the words of Steve Della Casa in the documentary, it was the left left sidewalk of the Via Veneto.
Yeah.
In other words, the right sidewalk were Fellini, Antonioni, and all those guys. And then on the left side were like Piero Vivarelli and Fulci, Corbucci, and, the prostitutes. And, but there was this other world of Italian cinema. And I think Piero is a prism through which you kind of get a glimpse of that world. And I think that was an interesting aspect of it.
I mean, it's interesting also the way in which you said he rode that wave, where he was kind of, it was a kind of Phil Spector in a way, of an Italian Phil Spector in that point, not going on to be a murderer. Let me just, but he's like an Italian Phil Spector, and then he morphs into being. Obviously, he worked in the movie, was working on movies at the beginning, but he morphs into being a film director. And do you, in terms of the way in which he thought about making movies, the kinds of movies, obviously there were, as you say, it's that secret history, commercial diktats. But in terms of what he cared about in terms of movies, what would you say kind of exemplified the kinds of movies he was interested in making? Because they are so diverse, and although there's a certain kind of maybe erotic continuity in them, comparing Black Decameron to something, it's quite difficult to kind of to go, oh yes, well that's quite obviously another Vivarelli movie. You can tell it is. I'm just interested in what you thought was the driving force between him wanting to make movies.
There's a comment by Pupi, who was assistant director on.
He's very funny in the film, I think.
On Satanic, and he said that when he was there and he was watching Piero directing, he was amazed by the amount of personalities of the times coming to visit, being on the set, and entertained by this guy who was directing a movie, but was also holding course, having friends around. And he thought making a movie was extremely easy if it's done that way. And he said that's what he learned from Piero, that don't stress it, don't make it like, oh my gosh, like that. And I worked with Pupi in the past as a director, film wrote by him, etc. And Pupi was the same. He was very relaxed on the set. And I think that's true, that he learned from Piero. And I must say, yeah, that's the way. I mean, he would do whatever just to enjoy it. I think his drive was the libido, the pleasure of pursuing projects and getting somewhere. And obviously, as the documentary shows, he was always distracted by something else, and sometimes it kind of sidetracked him somewhere, and sometimes not. I mean, it was the life energy, I guess. So if he had a problem, there were a couple of movies that he was really into it. One was about garimpeiros, Brazilian gold diggers, etc. Very political, but also very exotic and probably very sexual, also erotic, etc. And he probably put a lot of energy in that, and then it didn't happen. I imagine that while he was 100% into that, something else came up, and they proposed him to do it, and he said, "Yeah, sure, let's go for that." That was I'm a documentary filmmaker, but I come from fiction, and I consider myself a historical B-movie director of the Italian B-movies of the 80s. I made a couple of horror movies, etc. So I sort of remember that mood, that feeling that, you get a line as an idea for a movie, and then as soon as you get a producer vaguely interested in that, you go 100% after that project, and maybe it happens. That's how he was pursuing his project.
I just wanted to add one thing to that, just because of the title that we gave the documentary, Life as a B-Movie. And it's really not a gimmick. And I think that, he made musical movies. He made movies from comic books. He made a political movie, or, a movie about the Berlin Wall when the Berlin Wall was coming up. He made an existential movie that's sort of a la Antonioni that he shot in Argentina. He made the so-called erotic exotic trilogy, The Snake God, The Black Decameron, and what's it called? An Oriental Cronache d'Amore Orientale, Chronicles of Oriental Love, which he shot in Thailand. Then he made a thriller with a porn star. He made a movie in Cuba. I mean, he really did almost everything. But the movie that I think represents him the most is a film called Nella misura in cui, which is featured in the documentary, which is a totally autobiographical movie about himself. And I think that that is sort of the quintessential Piero Vivarelli movie. It's like, you know, and it represents sort of a kind of fantasy of what I thought filmmaking would be like, you know, when I was a child. You know, it's like, oh yeah, I'm living this, and now I'm going to make a film about it. You know, and he had this sort of narcissism and self-indulgence to do that, to actually do that.
Which, I'm sorry to interrupt, but makes me think of the today's influencer. Like their life is their meaning, and that's kind of what he did in that movie.
And you just spanned over that very, very diverse career, shot in different places. I mean, how difficult was it? I mean, are the films that we see these tantalizing glimpses of in your wonderful documentary, are those films now going to be made more accessible? Are they all? Was it easy to get hold of them? Are they all preserved in the archives, or was it a real kind of detective hunt to actually be able to get hold of his canon of movies?
It was very hard. I must say, very, very hard.
It must have been.
Like the movie, the Nella misura in cui, the autobiography, it was a total failure at the box office. Was co-produced by the Italian Ministry of Culture at the time. So since it didn't make any money, they didn't print any copy of it. And the only copy available is the Cineteca di Stato in Cinecittà. It was very hard to get, you know, to get a decent copy of it, which, you know, doesn't really exist. Other movies like The Snake God, that is on DVD, high quality, was projected in Venice, etc. And others like the one done in Argentina, I think, as he said in the documentary, was supposed to go to the Venice Festival, was invited for a screening there. It never made it to Venice because of a car accident of the producer distributor. And I guess nobody's seen it after, you know, it was shown probably in one movie theater in Italy that summer, and that was it. So it wasn't easy to, but we did our homework and we kind of got almost everything.
No, and that's what's wonderful is seeing this vista of for people like myself, certainly non-Italian, but even I suspect from what you're saying, Italian, seeing you know, examples of these movies that have not really been made accessible to us at all, and not understanding that. I mean, we're running out of time, but there's a few other questions I want to ask. I mean, you talk about him making these movies in different countries, which he clearly did. He went all over the world making these movies. I mean, you said he was charming, but where did he get the money to make them? I know they're low budget, but even so, you've still got to persuade somebody, Roger Corman-like, to part with the cash. And he obviously was very, very good at charming people in different countries and in Italy to let him make the movie he wanted to make.
Well, the interesting thing about that, which actually we didn't cover in the documentary, is that my uncle's main producer was Alfredo Bini, who was actually Pasolini's main producer. So Alfredo Bini produced Pasolini and Vivarelli. And the fact is that my uncle's movies did quite well at the box office. The Snake God was a big success, but even some of the others. And the other thing, which we do go into in the documentary, is the fact that in those days, commercial Italian movies went around the world, and there really was a market for them. And he was very aware of that. I mean, I think it can be said that he did put his personal stamp on his films, but I mean, he knew he had to play the market, and he did. And of course, it's also true that his producer, Alfredo Bini, went totally bankrupt as well. And left him in Africa, you know, on a set with no money in Senegal, as we show in the documentary. Yeah. But yeah, he was a hustler, you know. He was always, but he did have the ammunition in the fact that his films, you know, did perform at the box office.
One thing I wanted to ask you as well, which comes back to Cameron, was and obviously his second wife, is that for the time he seems a remarkably unracially prejudiced person. That you know, his films have a kind of tolerance and diversity in them that's unusual for, you know, 70s cinema, not just, you know, Italian cinema, you know, non-English language, English language cinema. And that's quite an unusual characteristic of him, that he seemed a remarkably, a remarkably inclusive person.
Yeah. Well, I think that is something that can be said about my uncle, and this is something that Olivier Père remarks on, and this is one of the reasons that he was so he admires the Snake God so much, is because the Snake God really was ahead of its time, in that it depicted a colonial situation in a totally non-colonial way, and you know, you have a Black woman who is portrayed as an empowered figure, and you know, that was quite, and he was in that respect totally ahead of his time.
I think if I may figure where it comes from, I think it comes from jazz. He was a big jazz lover. So that was it. I mean, jazz, you can be a racist and love jazz. There's no way around it.
Very difficult, yes. No, that's a very good point. Well, I'm aware we're reaching the end of our time, but I wanted to, I mean, apart from saying congratulations on a terrific film, I wanted to ask you both, what do you think? I mean, what would you like people to take away from the movie? I mean, because I think that it's a rich tapestry of an incredible portrait of a unique character. It's a access to Italian cinema that we're not necessarily familiar with, and a canon of work. But what would you say his legacy would be if he was here and you were to be asking him, what would you say he would want his legacy to be, now that you've kind of restored knowledge about his career to audiences in a way that we just didn't have before? What would you like the legacy of him to be?
I would say to believe in try to do things that you like, and don't be subdued by, you know, the institution, the religion, the mainstream, the market. If you believe in something, you want to try, go ahead and do it. You don't. One thing that definitely it wasn't for was the money. He never pursued success economically. He didn't care. He didn't get it, and he was happy with that, I guess. And that's what I think probably also we did.
And Nick, has the film changed the perception of him in the family? Did the family think of him differently? I mean, how did they receive the film when you've shown it to them, or they've got to see it?
Yeah, I think it has, especially with his son Oliviero, who is featured in the doc.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, it's been really important in that respect, and even, you know, the other people who other members of the family. It's been a sort of vindication, I think, in a way, and in a broader sense, I think the takeaway is just this kind of sort of unconventionality, this kind of, you know, just don't let anyone box you in, and I think that energy that came out of the Second World War, I think, you know, is you see that in other directors as well. There is a kind of instinctive kind of way of making movies, you know, that just comes from your inner self, and even if you are making a commercial film, you're still unconstrained, and I think that's probably something that even directors could look at and draw something from.
And you touched on the other elements of his family. I won't talk about it too much now, because I think you characterize it really well, about that, you know, the sort of tragic side of his relationship with his children, particularly his, you know, his son, who was also an actor, and Gabriele Salvatore talks very well, I think, in your film about that. But I think that's one of the things I really like about the film, is that you have conveyed that exuberance, you have conveyed that energy, you have conveyed that incredible charm of personality, but you've also done it warts and all, and you haven't concealed his flaws and the things that he got wrong and that failed in his personal life, which is why I think it is such a well-rounded portrait. But you've set it in a context of a cinema that we can hopefully rediscover more of now. You've given that to us, which I think is a great gift. So congratulations, gentlemen. It's a really, really entertaining and compelling film. I know that audiences, I'm sure on the platform, are going to really enjoy it. And I think it's going to be one of those films that we return to, that it's going to be one of those films that when people say, well, we've got to show something about the history of Italian cinema, here's a film that should be part of that program, because you've really given us a very big chunk back of access to Italian cinema that's, you know, those of us that are great admirers we're not familiar with. So thank you for doing that, and congratulations on a great film.
Thank you. Ultimately, we just want people to have fun, and I think
they will.
Time too.
Yeah, they will. It is lots of fun, and that's the thing, is that he's fun. Lots of the people in it are fun, and the clips are tremendous fun, and actually, you know, make you want to see more.
All right.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to talk to you. I hope I get the chance, you know, not to be on Zoom and to talk to you both in person at some point, and maybe have a drink, as we would have done in London if you'd have been there.
Looking forward to, fingers crossed.